Detective Comics 27, Amazing Fantasy 15, Action Comics number 1. Every comic book collector has these etched into their brain as they're some of the most iconic comics to ever hit newsstands. What makes them so special? Each of them holds a first appearance. Batman, Spider-Man, and Superman, probably the three most well-known characters in all of comic books. And if there's one video game character that is as easily recognizable as these three superheroes, it's the plumber himself. Have you ever thought about collecting first appearances of your favorite video game characters? 5 or 10 years ago, that might not have been on your mind. But in recent years, we've seen the prices of video games skyrocket like never before. And while it might seem like literally everything is approaching that unobtainable level, there is actually a trend. Today, I want to look at some firsts in video game history and answer the question, will first appearances in video games ever matter? Not too long ago, if I wanted to own a sealed Halo 1, it would have been no big deal. I'd get on eBay and find somebody with new old stock and shoot him $30. But people are catching on, and those people are more experienced collectors, oftentimes comic collectors, and they're coming into this very young market and seeing the potential that video games have as collectibles. They're making investments in things that they feel will become valuable, things that they've seen firsthand in their own markets, key issues. Why isn't Halo $30 anymore? It's gotta be one of the best-selling games on the platform, right? That means it's common. Well, you're right. It was the second or third best-selling game on the Xbox. But the majority of those units aren't sealed anymore. And that's the key. Is it sealed, and what kind of grade will this shrink wrap get me? When you look at sold listings and sort by highest price, you'll see what copies of Halo sell for the most money. First print, sealed, graded, or gradable copies. So let's break down Halo since we're on the topic. What's so special about Halo Combat Evolved? It's the first game in an extremely beloved series. It's historically important for helping bring the first-person shooter genre into the modern era, especially for consoles. It's the first appearance of the iconic Master Chief, but above everything, it's an exclusive that PlayStation and Nintendo consoles never saw. We'll be focusing on the first appearance part in this video essay, but the rest of this is also relevant. So let's go ahead and use this criteria for some other games. Let's take it back to that plumber I mentioned earlier. What was his first appearance? It was technically a Donkey Kong arcade cabinet, but from an investor's standpoint, is that really collectible? Let's see, was it ever sealed? Maybe in a cardboard shipping box? Well, can you get it graded at least? Nope. So let's move on to Mario's next appearance. Was it that record-breaking Super Mario Bros. On NES? Not even close. The correct answer is probably the Donkey Kong Game & Watch, but once again, while it may have come sealed, it's not a piece of software that you can insert into a console. Some people will even argue that it's not a video game at all. The first gradable home console appearance of Mario is Donkey Kong either on Atari 2600 or Intellivision. I honestly can't tell you which one came first, but they both released in 1982 and a sealed graded copy of each will cost you maybe a couple grand. Ungraded copies obviously sell for even less. Why is that? Why can you get a brand new copy of both Mario and Donkey Kong's first appearances for less than $2,500? Obviously that's not cheap for a video game, but relatively speaking, we have people spending hundreds of thousands on later Mario games. The money just isn't in pre-1983 video games. If it's not on a Nintendo console, I just don't think people care as much about it. Of course, that could certainly change. But this is the introduction to the point I'll be trying to make in this video. In terms of collectability, is the first appearance more or less important than the game itself? Now let me list some more first appearances of iconic video game franchises and you tell me when you see a trend. We talked about Mario and Master Chief already, so let's talk about Kirby. His first appearance was Kirby's Dream Land, and then there's Samus, who originated in Metroid, and Link, who started in The Legend of Zelda, and Fox McCloud, who first appeared in Star Fox. Okay, let's talk non-Nintendo characters. How about Sonic? Sonic the Hedgehog on Genesis. Okay, and Crash and Spyro are from Crash 1 and Spyro 1. And Kratos, God of War. See what I mean? These are incredibly boring. The majority of first appearances in video games are just the first game of the series. It's here that I'd like to make a comparison to the comic book world. Earlier I mentioned Amazing Fantasy 15. If you're unfamiliar with comics, Amazing Fantasy isn't the Spider-Man comic that's still running today. That would be Amazing Spider-Man. Amazing Fantasy was just a sci-fi book that had nothing to do with Spider-Man until its final issue. This issue was pretty much unrelated to the ones before it and was the introduction of a brand new character. And this is often how it was for comic books. The best analogy to video games would be if you wanted to own the first appearance of Captain Toad. There were short puzzle levels in Super Mario 3D World that featured this character, and 12 months later an entire game based on this idea was created. And to make the story even more interesting, Captain Toad originally appeared in Super Mario Galaxy, making that his first appearance. Let's continue though, there are other first appearances that aren't boring. Plumber number 2 wasn't in Donkey Kong, but we already said arcades don't matter to collectors, so who cares about that? Same with Game & Watches, so Luigi's first console appearance is in 1983's Mario Bros. On Atari 2600. While Super Mario Bros. May not be the first appearance of Mario and Luigi, it is the first appearance of Toad, Bowser, and Peach. In 1989, we saw Daisy for the first time in Super Mario Land, and Super Mario Land 2 gave us Wario. In 1990, we got Yoshi in Super Mario World, or 91 if you don't live in Japan. Jump to the current millennium and we finally got Waluigi in 2000's Mario Tennis for N64. Moving away from Nintendo now, Tails and Knuckles came in Sonic 2 and 3 respectively. Metal Sonic and Amy Rose both first appeared in Sonic CD, Shadow came in Sonic Adventure 2, and I could go on. Sonic's a great example of a franchise that kept adding a ton of really important characters as new games came out. And by important, I mean characters that A, became recurring in future games, and B, were adored by fans. Now all of these are pretty cool. It falls more in line with the "this character first appeared in Tales of Suspense 39" rather than Iron Man 1 mindset. But literally no one is buying Mario Tennis on N64 to flaunt that they have the first appearance of Waluigi. I mean, I am, but no one else is. It's just irrelevant, at least right now, and I'm not sure that it'll ever be relevant. Now, it's not always the first appearances of characters themselves that make comics skyrocket. Sometimes it's just the first time they put on a piece of clothing. So we look at Secret Wars 8, the first time Spidey was ever in the black suit. And do we see that translate into games at all? Not yet, we haven't. I mean, a couple of examples would be like the first appearance of Mario with a PhD or Luigi as a Ghostbuster. They're cool and important in their own ways, but first appearances of those suits or vacuums are not what make those games matter to collectors. Now, to kind of step away from first appearances for a second, sometimes it's the story arc or key event that makes a comic more desirable and collectible. When we look at issue 121 of The Amazing Spider-Man, it's easy to tell why a collector would want to own it. It's the death of Gwen Stacy, Peter Parker's first true love, who was killed by the Green Goblin. That's huge. And this kind of separates comics from video games a little bit. Comics are read for the story. Video games in the early years were played exclusively for the actual gameplay, which makes it hard to compare here. In 1981, no one was playing Frogger for the plot. Even as developers started putting more of an emphasis on story, adding cutscenes and tons of dialogue, these games wouldn't have been so memorable 40 years later if their gameplay wasn't good. Comic books aren't interactive, and while a lot of people will play games just to hear the story nowadays, I think the actual gameplay still heavily outweighs the plot. There are some exceptions, especially in visual novels and Telltale style games, but to throw a generalized statement over the industry, that statement holds true. All of this is to say, I think the best comparison to an iconic comic book arc would be something like Halo Reach or Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, both iconic for having impactful stories on their respective series. Could we ever see a game become collectible primarily because of its legacy on the plot? I think it's possible, but it would have to be very far down the road when the story has progressed significantly. And Metal Gear might be a bad example of this considering the state of things with Konami and the series, but if Halo 47 comes out in the year 2104 and people still care about owning physical media, I think the game might hold a little value. While first appearances technically exist in video games, they're so much more than that. They're the foundations of entire worlds. No one's picking up a sealed Zelda because they want to have the first appearance of Link. I mean, in a sense, that is part of the reason, but it's more than that. Zelda began a long-running franchise of games that are so beloved and important to the industry as a whole. The game that started it all is obviously an iconic collectible that would be easily recognizable by anyone walking into your game room. And don't get me wrong, Batman #1 is an incredibly important book that has insane value, but it's not the same as having his first appearance. And when you compare that to Mario, it's gonna cost me $1,000 to have his first console appearance, and that's a lot of money, but my gosh, have you seen the sales for a matte sticker Super Mario Bros? It's completely backwards from comics, at least in this example. Will first appearances in video games ever reach the magnitude of importance that they have in comic books? I highly doubt it. The fact that Yoshi first appeared in Super Mario World is vastly overshadowed by the fact that Super Mario World was one of the greatest games ever made. Crash's first appearance in Crash Bandicoot is meaningless when compared to the fact that the game was so unbelievably popular in the 90s. He was practically the face of PlayStation at one point. The same can be said for so many of the characters we've discussed today, and I think that's where comics and video games really differ. Detective Comics 27, even if it was a good read or a best-selling comic book of 1939, the first appearance of freaking Batman overshadows all of that. That being said, video games are still extremely young, and the hobby of collecting them is even younger, so one day the first appearance of Crash may overshadow the fact that it was a great game for its time. So check back here in 25 years and we'll see what makes Crash Bandicoot so special. Thank you for watching, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the matter in the comments.